Welcome, everyone. I am Hector Hoyos, and I co-chair the group on law and literature in the Global South, along with Joseph Wager. It is my great pleasure to introduce this event, and Joe will introduce our speaker. It is the beginning of the spring quarter 2024. We've had a very successful series over the last year and a half, and I'm happy to say that we have applied for renewal for this group for yet another year. During this time, we have really seen a change in the way that law and humanities are conceived and studied, not just at Stanford, but especially at Stanford, where we're located. It used to be a very northern-centered paradigm, and more we're seeing the thought that originates in the Global South, as varied and complicated as it is, not as a homogeneous whole, but something that can really articulate some of the concerns that we see in law and humanities, having to do not just with formal legal proceedings or with the explicit thematization of the law, but also with implicit questions of justice. Our previous event with Professor Heian Lee and Professor Marco Wan here on the Stanford campus really honed in on some of those themes. So I just mentioned these words at the onset to build a thread with what happened before, and I will pass it over to Joe.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Just to talk a little bit about the dynamic before I present our speaker today, Dr. Cecilia Sosa. Dr. Sosa will speak for about 30-ish minutes, and we'll use a webinar format and record that. And then we'll move to something a little more informal. We'll stop the recording, and then those who are attendees will be promoted to panelists if they like, and that way we can have kind of a more informal conversation. And yes, just to reiterate some of the, Hector's, Dr. Hoyos' words, this group focuses on law and literature in the Global South. Recent events have looked at the concept of high and low justice in Chinese cultural production. Our next presentation will be on unhinging border law with Dr. Lakmali Jayasingh, and then we'll also have Vidler Guerra Corvelo, who will be speaking about Wayu cosmovision and legal world making in what is now Colombia. And I think we always try to bring and think capaciously, what does it mean to think about law, humanities? What does it mean to think about law and literature, and how each of these parts of this cognate kind of critique each other, right? And create new bases to think more openly about what it means to think about law when talking about literature, and what does it mean to think about literature when talking about law. And film, obviously, is part of the way we understand law and literature capaciously. All right, just want to mention as well, today our event has been generously co-sponsored by Stanford's Clayman Institute for Agenda Research. And our speaker today, Cecilia Sosa, is an Argentinian sociologist and cultural journalist, currently working as a senior researcher at the Center for Memory Studies in Post-Conflict Cultures at the University of Nottingham. Her PhD in drama was awarded the most distinguished thesis of the year in 2012 by the AHGBI. And her first monograph is entitled, I have it here, very important for my own thinking at least, research, is the Queering Acts of Mourning in the Aftermath of Argentina's Dictatorship, which came out in 2014. And she has published extensively on the crossroads of memory, performance, and affect in journals such as Memory Studies, the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, and Latin American Theater Review. She's also co-curator and co-scripter of what brings us here today, Cantos Insumisos, Rebel Songs, directed by Alejo Moguillansky. Hope I'm saying that right. Maybe I didn't have this Argentine enough, so my apologies. And she has also recently co-edited the book Voices of Democracy, Argentina 1983 to 2023, and forms part of this larger project of screaming violence, which, as I understand, Dr. Sosa, you will mention today, and also talk a little bit about the making of the film, what the film tells us, how it helps us to think differently about these questions of memory, gender, and also this very prescient moment that is being lived in Argentina, but also in other contexts as well. And I will also add the link and password for the film for those who weren't able to see it before today's. I highly, highly recommend watching this really, really moving documentary. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sosa.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, both to you, Joe, and Hector. It is a really, really beautiful pleasure for me and a big honor to be here with you and to have the opportunity to discuss with you some of the nuances of what it was being part of this project in filming and doing together this film, Cantos Insumisos, Rebel Songs. I have to say at the very beginning, as I was anticipating to Joe a minute ago, that this is a project that we have done together with Philippa Page, who is based at Newcastle, and hopefully she will be able to join us a little bit later for the discussion. I will love that. I think we have been working mostly together in all these issues. So my idea today is to tell you a little bit. I have divided the talk into sections. The first one is related to the bigger project, the screening violence. I would like to tell you a little bit more about the project, how we work on it, the main aims and methodologies, and then go straight away to discuss a little bit more things related to the film, and providing you a bit of context about the film and the resonances that this film has recuperated. As you, I will be sure that we have some time left for the discussion at the end. And I'm really curious about your impressions about the film. I wonder whether you might have felt lost among the local references and the change of characters and stories. And I wouldn't be surprised, because this is not at all a pedagogical film. And it's quite intricate in terms of the set of multiple layers that brings together voices and affections. And as we say in the prologue of the film, editing it was as rewriting Dante's Divine Comedy. This is a sort of a quote from Alejo Moguillansky, our filmmaker. So, but we come back to this later in the discussion. So if you agree, I would like to just start a little bit telling you about the bigger project that this project is immersed. There we are. So Cantos Insumisos, Rebel Songs was made in the context of a larger project, and the project was entitled Screening Violence and Transnational Study of Post-Conflict Imaginaries, which took place between 2018 and 2023, and still is in place because some of the outcomes of the project are still pending. So the project was based at Newcastle University. You can see the original team of all the scholars working and who put together the project. And there, the blonde one in the middle, the only woman of the project, is Philippa Page, my colleague, who will be probably joining us later in the discussion. And the project was formed by different teams of scholars and filmmakers researching on the current aftermath of violence in 5 very different post-conflict societies: Colombia, Indonesia, Algeria, Northern Ireland, and Argentina. The experiences of violence that all these countries have to face, and some of them are still facing, are of course very different. Somehow we want to put in dialogue the anti-communist massacres in Indonesia that took place in 1965, the 60-year Colombian multi-armed conflict in Colombia, the process of post-colonial civil war in Algeria during the 90s, and the political conflict known as the Troubles that went from the 1960 to 1990 in Northern Ireland and still continue somehow today, despite the agreement, and the experience of state terrorism in Argentina during the 70s. So the possibility of grasping the local textures of those contexts was extremely central to this transnational project. In fact, screening violence could be conceived as a 5-piece jigsaw constellation that wanted to provide a fresh understanding of how social imaginaries shape civil conflicts and transitions in these 5 different societies. So very importantly, against the one-size-fits-all approach, a common perspective that you might know from transnational justice and peace studies, our project wanted to engage in an immersive way with a multi-layer life world of real communities in each location. To do that, the conceptual lens that we used was that of the social imaginaries, the term originally termed by Cornelius Castoriadis, help us to explore how each community imagined their own conflict from their specific locations and historical context. This conceptual lens allowed us to place the local textures of conflict within a transnational framework. Yet the very idea of social imaginary is very difficult to capture. The more it unfolds, the more complex it seems to become. As a point of departure, we used Dilip Gonkar's definition of new imaginaries as a creative force in making the worlds. You might be familiar with his work as well. So, but mainly here, film was the method. So to chart those local imaginaries of violence, our main method was cinema. Intrinsically an imaginary space, the medium of film provided a pathway to navigate the multiplicity of landscapes and times involved in our project. It was also a privileged means of combining academic and creative practice, including filmmaking, encouraging a cross-fertilization of these two strategies. In this manner, films became a form of address, a way of exploring the ordinary feelings in relation to violence that resonated within and across different groups, times, and countries. This approach to mapping the imaginaries of post-conflict also took on board Juliana Bruno's invitation to consider films as affective landscapes. Films then became a way of creating a contact zone for analysis, a surface of affective engagement to explore, in our case, the intricate ways in which Argentine society negotiates on an everyday basis the aftermath of its experience of violence. So, as I was saying, our methodology was mixed, interdisciplinary and participatory. You might ask, and you will be totally right, how all this work in practice. Well, in each country, we conducted reception groups in which we screened films from each other sides involved in the project. So the transnational exchange encouraged a non-competitive and non-reductive comparison among countries. It also provided our participants with a critical distance to engage with conflicts that were not their own. See, so films that were coming from different countries were screened within each focus group. The focus groups encouraged participants in each country to reflect on post-dictatorship transition from a new perspective. While adapting practices from reception studies, we wanted to capture more visceral and affective responses from the participants to each film. The post-screening discussions became a space of conversation to discover how the past continues to shape the present in both small and omnipresent ways. One of the guiding ideas was to break, or try at least to break, the local hierarchies of conflict, making room for new voices to emerge, voices that might have been neglected or unheard, voices for whom the questions of post-conflict transition were not usual topics of discussion. So, for you to have an idea, these were some of the films that we show in each location. There were different sorts of films, some documentaries, some fictions, both long or short films. And you might remember seeing fragments of them included in Cantos Insumisos, Rebel Songs. They were mostly backgrounds, flashes of other screenings, prompting as new inquiries. You might also recall some fragments of discussions that took place in the context of our focus groups. There is a discussion on Falsos Positivos, a Colombian documentary, and the similarities with the Argentinian context, and also fragments of The Visit, Swan, a short fictional film from Indonesia, which shows two childhood friends separated by the political conflict that came together 40 years later. So these discussions took place in the context of the focus groups. Some of them were parts of the film, some of them went into the film, and some went into more conventional academic work. In Argentina, we had many focus groups. We have, for instance, a group of young women in their 20s from a modest suburb in Buenos Aires, a community of cinema lovers in the city of Córdoba, a group of elderly students from a national free university, a branch of young activists of the Conservative Party, a group that regularly meets at the hairdresser salon in the outskirts of the city to watch films. And we also run a small focus group in Monte, a small town 80 miles away from Buenos Aires, which was permeated by another tragedy that happened some time ago. But I would like to return to this later on, just because of question of time. So our cartography to track the local imaginaries of violence began, to say the least, and ended with cinema. Our project initiated the search by screening films about the conflicts that have taken place in another 4 sites, and it ended by creating its own cinematic expression of the imaginary. And in our case, this expression is Cantos Insumisos. And here you can see some images of the first screening of the film in April last year in Buenos Aires, 1 year ago. It was an open terrace in a community center where we projected the screen onto the walls. It was 28 degrees this autumn time in Buenos Aires. And many of the protagonists of the film were there. We had wine and empanadas, and more than a sophisticated cinema environment, we wanted to propose a celebratory encounter to just highlight the collective experience of building something together. We were also the first team of the project in finishing our documentary. So 4 other of the films that belong to the project are still in the process of production. And the idea is that all these productions will have the capacity to circulate and generate new conversations as the one that we are having today. There will be also an anthology putting fragments of the films together that we're waiting to see, hopefully by the end of this year. In each case, all of the teams had the freedom to choose with which filmmaker they wanted to work with. With Philippa, my colleague, we decided to work alongside a filmmaker that would not come from a traditional memory post-conflict field. By contrast, we were really willing to renovate visual vocabularies of memory. And so we decided to work with Alejo, one of the founding members of the independent producer Pampero. And he did not even work in documentaries, not even in violence. He mostly does fictions, light spirits, quirky comedies, and which loosely are inspired in the Nouvelle Vague. His films have been exhibited at Cannes Festival and other major festivals around the world. And I think you can recognize a little bit of this quirky tradition in Cantos Insumisos. As already mentioned, it's not a pedagogical film, it's not chronological, there are not clear references, and boundaries between documentary fiction also tend to blur. More than guiding the spectators through the different layers of violence still resonated in contemporary Argentina, the film proposes an affective immersion in them. So precisely because of this, I'd like to bring into your consideration some of the themes of the local aftermath of violence in Argentina, which has made the case quite unique into the transnational memory field. I am particularly referring to the cross-fertilization of gender, memory, and violence that took place in the country, especially in the last few years. I hope this insight might help to illuminate some of the sequence of the film in a different, novel way. So I'm going now to the part 2 of the talk. And I have divided this little presentation in 10 little acts. So the first one. The aftermath of the brutal dictatorship that took over in Argentina from 1976 to 1983 does not seem to follow chronological time. Since 1977, the main icon figures of the resistance have been the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, who have been demanding the reappearance of their children kidnapped by the military terror. For more than 4 decades, the mothers have repeated their silent walk across Buenos Aires main square. When democracy was recovered in 1983, her claim, "Our children gave life to us," could be thought of the point of departure for a reverse lineage that is not governed by blood. This non-biological temporality has marked the local imaginary of violence for the last 4 decades. With their heads covered with the white scarves, the mothers have aged in front of the most public square. They have become a live installation of mourning for the new generations to come. the number. The local imaginary of violence has also remained attached to the persistence of a number. The 30,000 disappeared. The lives that were perished by the military terror. Many of the so-called disappeared were tortured in clandestine detention centers, dragged and thrown into the water. The very name of the disappeared suggests the haunting presence of an absence. You might remember at the beginning of the film, there is a huge monument with the endless list of names, and that we were filming with Alejo. This monument is located in the Memory Park, a space of art and commemoration, just in front of the river where many of the disappeared were thrown alive. So as Martin Cohen, an Argentinian writer, argued, the 30,000 is an open inquiry for the responsible of the crimes. It acts as a reminder that the fate of the disappeared has not been revealed yet. Each time the number has been denied by public servants, as it happens now with the far right in power, there has been a response. Over 4 decades, those 30,000 gone beyond all statistics. It names a transgenerational community mourning that grows across time. So the network of association created by the relatives of the victims of state terrorism in Argentina took the form of a peculiar family, a wounded family, I have said. In Argentina, we have the mothers, the grandmothers, the relatives, and the children of disappeared. In the 1990s, the children of disappeared created the scratches, the loud and festive parades that denounced the crimes committed against their parents. The grandmothers have relied on DNA tests to recover the 133 out of the 500 estimated babies to have been stolen during the dictatorship and raised under falsified identities. In one of the sequences of the film, we can see one of the recovered grandchildren, Javier Matias Darux, maybe you remember him, recalling with his partner now how he learned about being a children of disappeared and recovering his biological identity. This is a scene that was shot inside a cafe in Córdoba, a northern province in Argentina. You might remember her partner complaining that he did not call him to tell her the news, but just send an audio message. So all these organizations formed by the victims and the relatives of the victims of the state violence in Argentina have evoked their biological ties to the missing to make their claims for justice. However, their form of assembly has also exceeded traditional family ties. Still, within this familiar performance, bloodline ties have re-emerged strangely displaced and even subverted. Non-implicated audiences have also adopted this lineage of loss. They have embraced grief as an expanded form of kinship. This sort of displacement is one of the threads that we wanted to capture in our film. We wanted to show how violence had also created new forms of kinship and forms of being together after loss. The legal pathway, and this is something that might interest many of you. As you know, the local imaginary of transition in Argentina is not about reconciliation or about forgiveness. Rather, it has been mainly about legal trials and the possibility of justice. In 1985, the heads of the military junta were taken to a civil court, and many of them sentenced to life imprisonment. Argentina was the first nation in South America to take its former dictator to court. A few years ago, the historic 1985 trial was made into a film, which you might have heard about. The title is precisely Argentina 1985. The film won a Golden Globe and received standing ovations across the country. It celebrated the epic narrative of a nation that managed to confront its own past, which became part of the local mantra, Nunca más, never again. Although in the 90s, a presidential pardon was granted to many of the perpetrators, in 2003, the impunity laws were declared unconstitutional and the trials started again and continue today. The traces of the legal path have also permeated our film. You might remember another opening scene when we can see a dramatization of a trial. It belongs to Cuarto Intermedio, Recess, a practical right for trials against humanity. Post-memorial playful piece created by Felix Rosone, a writer whose parents are disappeared, and Monica Zweig, a French lawyer, daughter of an exiled couple, who moved back to Argentina to become an expert in these trials, precisely. The piece is a satiric tour around the trials currently in place in the country, and sometimes it also echoes a southern version of a Star Wars saga. You can see them kind of fighting with the swords and related kind of explaining the trials to the monkeys, apes, big apes that are coming to colonize the country. In our film, we can see some members of the audience reading fragments of the trial. Now, with the far right in power, nothing can be taken for granted, not even the trials. This theater piece, and maybe also our film, becomes then a communal act of resistance and maybe reparation. The Argentine imaginary has also traveled transnationally. During the course of our project, we discovered that the fight of the mothers of Plaza de Mayo can inspire other groups of mothers in Colombia, in Algeria, and Indonesia. In Spain, also, the idea of the disappeared became a sort of memory icon. It shed light to the 150,000 Spanish Republicans buried in clandestine and marked mass graves during Franco regimes. These transnational resonances also speak about the strength of Argentina's post-conflict imaginary. Another pervasive trend in Argentine post-conflict imaginary is the presence of humor, a peculiar tone that could span from a dark sense of humor to a playful spirit to relate to the experience of loss. When memory risked becoming officialized, the new generations, those contemporary to the children of disappeared, proposed new post-memorial narratives to relate to loss. They poked fun at the privilege of the victims while inventing experimental, playful, and even transgender characters to speak about the legacies of terror. You might also have some traces of this tone while watching the film. Of course, again, the theater piece, Recess, Cuarto Intermedio, mentioned is a clear part of this trend. And we have also this idea of forced pain to cry with joy, as Marta Dillon writes in Aparecida, a letter that she writes to her disappeared mother. The reverberations of this audacious tone inaugurated a new turn in the aftermath of violence, which is also part of the film. There are some sequences that we can just discuss a little bit later, mostly when we can see Mariana Eva Perez, the author of Diary of a Montonero Princess, which you can see her face there, is staged in a fictional environment in the blue stairs, which was actually Alejo's house, and replicating a stairs that was found in the main detention center, and where she experienced a sort of erotic sequence with her partner. And this is part of this tone that avoids victimization, and is really so crucial and so interesting to reveal and to pick up in terms of imaginary of violence in Argentina. Scarves. The aftermath of violence in Argentina and the 40 years of democracy now have also been signposted by scarves. These pieces of cheap fabric have mobilized powerful assemblages. The white scarves originally were worn by the mothers since 1970s, and originally square nappies, and the green scarves adopted more recently by a new generation of feminists. During the conservative period that went from 2015 to 2019, a brand new feminist collective, Ni Una Menos, Not One Less, took over the streets to denounce the rising numbers of femicides. A pervasive misogynist and patriarchal structure, which had been left almost intact by military terror, was then illuminated. Two very experiences of mourning became entangled. This cross-fertilization became clear during the campaign for the right to a free and safe abortion. The main protagonists were young women, mostly teenagers, who adopted the green neckerchief as the main icon of their fight. During the abortion campaign, the green scarves went viral. They had a white hair scarves imprinted upon them. The abortion law was finally passed at the end of the 2020. And here in the picture, you can see Nora Cortiñas, a founding member of the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, wearing both the white and the green scarves. There are also a couple of flashes of Nora in our film. Her image flagging the double scarves shows how much the reverberations of the old and new struggles can reinforce one another. In fact, this encounter between memory and feminism gets present in many sequences of the film. There are feminist demonstrations, flags, scarves. There is also a scene where we can see Alejandra Naftal, the former director of ESMA Museum, explaining how she was awakened to her own experience of being a survivor, thanks to the new generation of feminist activists. Maybe you recall her image in the film. We can even listen to Judith Butler, the American gender scholar, speaking next to Estela Carlotto, the president of the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. And there is also a King Kong climbing the Empire State, followed by the Green Wave. I am tempted to say that this encounter between memory and feminism is one of the frames of the film, one that helps to unwrap the contemporary resonances and textures of the local aftermath of violence. So, in fact, in the last few years, new branches of the wanted family have emerged. These new groups have been a result of the encounter between the whites and the green scarves, the long memory tradition and the feminist tradition. On the one hand, we have Historias Desobedientes, Disobedient Stories, the organization formed by the relatives of the perpetrators of the dictatorship crimes. The group is mostly formed by disobedient daughters who repudiate the figures of their fathers. They have embraced both a rebellious, non-familiar feminism along the traditional pillars of the human rights movement, memory, truth, and justice. The group, particularly some of its members, are the main protagonists of this film. You might remember following them, the group into ESMA. For many of them, the very first visit to the main detention camp, we can see them discussing the transnational nuances of being the daughter of a perpetrator father with a German writer, the granddaughter of a Nazi perpetrator. And at some point, we also filmed them discussing with the daughters of the disappeared in a sort of a quite dodgy scene that we can discuss a little bit later. There, one of the daughters of the perpetrators said, "We are not victims. We have been affected by violence as every other citizen, with a plus. Terror was generated by our own fathers." As we have argued somewhere with Philippa, the association of daughters of the perpetrators stages an alternative form of coming out in the memory field that generates a radical disturbance within the transnational field of memory activism. But not only this group has emerged in recent years, there's also nietes, the grandchildren, the second generation of the disappeared, that has equally embraced the white and the green scarves. The group has intervened playfully the traditional human rights postcards and adding green scarves to the grandparents' necks and painting their lips in green. Both groups, Disobedient Stories and Nietes, indicate the arrival of new defiant relatives into the wounded family of victims. They show to which extent the imaginary of violence is poignantly alive. The anniversary. So there is a particular date in which all these transgenerational exchanges becomes more visible, the anniversary of the military coup on the 24th of March. During the last 4 decades, the anniversary of the military coup has become a strange celebration. Declared a National Day of Memory and public holiday since 2004, every year crowds have taken over the streets, chanting and singing everywhere. Every year, the traditional claims of memory, truth, and justice get entangled with the burning demands of the present. It has become the occasion in which these multiple intergenerational and transnational exchanges take place in the streets. As one of the protagonists of our film explains to his twin sons in the film, the 24M has become the mother of all human rights demonstrations. Actually, many sequences of the film have been shot during the demonstration in March 2019, before the pandemic. On that day, we accompanied photographer Mariana do Paso to the demonstration. You might recall her face, and she's talking there with Agustín Mendizalazo, who is a photographer and also part of the crew of our film. She is the former daughter of Miguel Echecolás, director of the police force during the dictatorship. The crimes of Echecolás included kidnapping, torture, and the theft of babies born in captivity. Echecolás died in prison in July 2022. That March, 24th of March of 2019, was the second time that Mariana attended the march. She felt unable to attend until legally changed her surname. She said, "Faced with this cruel and deadly affiliation, I no longer allow him to be my father," she explains in the film. Her practice of de-affiliation suggests an inversion of alternative forms of kinship that go beyond blood. Indeed, the daughters of perpetrators have unlocked a new turn in the imaginary of post-conflict in Argentina. By setting up a new alternative lineage, disaffiliating themselves with the criminal fathers, they showed how families are not just biological, but social structures supportive in affective and common ties. This queering of the traditional ties is also part of the non-linear temporalities that govern the aftermath of violence. It reminds of the reverse mandate, reverse pedagogy evident in the green side of young women who illuminated a collective path for women of all ages in the last few years. So, and I'm finishing now. This year was the first anniversary that took place during a leading administration that openly confronted the principles of human rights, seeking to dismantle the imaginary of nunca más, never again. The far-right administration that took office last December is led, as you know, by the self-declared anarcho-capitalist President Javier Milei and his vice president, Victoria Villarruel, an outspoken supporter of the perpetrators of state terrorism. With different styles, they have both disparaged the number of disappeared. They have openly justified the military crimes as part of what they call, or they have perceived as a war, as a necessary war. 2 weeks ago, for a new anniversary of the military coup, the multitude took over the streets in the major city of the country. Within this aversive political context, or precisely because of this, they show how the expanded community mourning will not be easily silenced. The massive demonstrations show that this community is still under construction, both as a promise and as an interrogation towards the future. Ultimately, it shows how the many ways in which mourning has made room for new forms of collective desire. That I think this idea of collective desire, I think, is pretty much also present in our film, or we hope so at least. So I think I'm going to stop here to open discussion. I love to hear your comments, both from the film and beyond. So yes, hopefully I'm not doing terribly bad with the time.
Cecilia, that was perfect. Can you all hear me now? Okay. Yes. Okay. Fantastic. I'm almost surprised because the technology has not been working with me today. So, Cecilia, I'd like to start by asking maybe a question, and I think Joe would like to do the same before we open it up to everyone, because this is part of the recorded portion. This is part of our new ways in which academia is making its waves in the public sphere. And so what I'd like to ask you is about the problem of generations, generaciones. There's really amazing moments in the documentary. You have the Marta Dillon, and you have this very strong position against lineage.
Sorry, Hector, I lost you for a minute.
Okay, let me switch. Joe, why don't you ask your question and I will go back to my cell phone because internet in Silicon Valley is just not reliable.
Now I can hear you perfectly well. If you want to go again, I think hopefully.
Okay, let's try.
Yeah.
But like in the good old days of Zoom, it can break up and we'll switch to cell phones again.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about generations and what is the problem with generations? What is wrong with generations, even when you have a book like Al diario de una princesa, montonera, of course, but still princesa. It's still the language of lineage and dynasty, even not just lineage. So what is wrong with generations?
That's a super interesting question. It has been kind of tormented my whole research for years and years, and I really appreciate it. Yes, there's a lot going on with generations and with bloodline ties and performance of blood, and also queering and rewriting these traditions once and again in a more defiant way. I think my impression, at least, is that both movements, both the human rights movement in all these familiar trends that involve, as I was saying before, the mothers, grandmothers, the children of disappear, the daughters of the perpetrators now, the new fashion hot group, and also nietes, the grandchildren of the disappear. All these familiar sort of traditions show this transgenerational way in which mourning has become expanded in a non-linear way, because there is a paradox about this generational attachment that all these groups have raised together, that is at the same time that they're building their linkage to the missing by blood, they are denying it and open it up to new forms of adoption of this lineage that goes beyond blood. And humor has been a platform in which these new audiences have been created in such a powerful way. I think, going to the question you mentioned, La Princesa Montonera, the diary of a Montonero princess, one of the protagonists of the film, she's a writer. She has both parents disappear. She looked for ages to she looked for her brother who was born in captivity, and she could finally found him in 2000. And she has poked fun of all the lineages and dynasties of blood of the human rights ghetto, as she calls all these organizations of the victims, but making fun of it. I think she has opened it up to new audiences that can embrace through laughter also, and through the satire, and being also part of the feeling part of this experience, politically, that goes beyond blood, and more ideological, and forming this new community mourning I was referring before, that this is the same proceeding that is happening in different lines and through different actors, I would say. I don't know if it's clear, the answer.
Absolutely, that is wonderful. I'll pass it over to Joe, and then maybe slide in another question later on.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I'll make a couple brief comments, a quick question, and then we'll open up and offer folks the chance to be panelists, and feel free to turn on your video or just have just the microphone open, or you can put your question in the chat. I just want to mention a few brief things that, you know, this concept with the film and the way it relates to the notion of legal performance, I think, is really powerful, right? The way the documentary structures, and also some of the kind of intertexts, right, with Cuarto Intermedio, right? And thinking about this, I think this is a really powerful way to think precisely about the relationship between law and the performances of trauma. And especially here with this idea of temporal governance, right? So in transitional justice societies, as some legal scholars have quoted, there's this idea of temporal governance. I think this idea of querying lineages and querying temporalities is really powerfully done in the film, and really gives a lot to work with, especially thinking within this larger jigsaw of other places. And I wonder there if the specific crime of disappearance has something to do with this ability to kind of queer these temporalities and queer these lineages, as opposed to other conflicts. Although I think in all these conflicts that you are studying here, disappearance and forced disappearance is a part of it. And then one of the other things is the role of humor. I know there was a workshop on disappearance, specifically here at Stanford a few years ago, and this is a really contentious point. Folks who were coming from the Colombian context, coming from the Mexican context, coming from the Southern Cone, had very different notions of how to think about and think through or think against the notion of humor. So I think that's also powerfully done. And I think there are very funny moments in this movie. The Bach piece, right? That's that I associate, and I imagine others too, with Dracula and where that comes in. But I guess the one question I'll leave with, and as I'll start to open the floor for folks to come in, is the notion of the guide. So we start with Dante, right? There's this rewriting of the Cantos of Dante. And then, so who would be the guide here? I have some ideas and I can share those.
The guides.
The guides, yes. So, and I imagine this would have to do with, on my hypothesis would be precise this idea of collective desire and collective grief, but also the role of sound. So I'm thinking about with and against Dante, but also with and against Fernando del Paso's great Palinuro de Mexico, where he rewrites, right, the Aeneid, and then here it's Palinurus, right, the lost seafarer, who is the guide through this kind of underworld of Mexico as it's going through refounding its history, but also specifically dealing with the aftermath of 68, Tlatelolco. So I guess that'll be my question. How do we think about the guide? And as I listen to your answer, I will start letting folks in.
I love your responses to this guide. I'm kind of taking notes, and I agree that could be all of them. I think sound, you pick up in something like quite interesting, and we received many comments in relation to how the sound was intervening in a violent way, an aggressive way, not being able to hear and to listen what was going on behind. And it was quite interesting because they were saying that it was a little bit disrespectful, again related to humor, of all these stories. And it was interesting because I think it was the very events, the night that we were kind of releasing the film for a very first time while drinking wine and having an empanada. And there were many people saying, well, but all these people would not stop talking at all because these are stories that need to be talked and again and again and again, and there is no potential limits. And I think our collaboration with Alejo tried to build this kind of humorous and playful jams in stories that are still ongoing in our minds and cannot be stopped because some of them are super terrifying as well. I'm thinking of Mariana and dealing with her father, who was like a criminal and who was responsible for killing so many people, and just deciding not allowing him anymore to be her father as such a powerful decision, and also inspiring desire and another collective ambition and passion that goes in another direction that is different to blood, a different performance, let's say, and looking for a new story to emerge. So I think the idea of the sound and collective desire as an interruption to break traditional and regular forms is quite powerful. But said this, and I would like Philippa, if you want to jump in at some moments as well, we are facing such a terrible and difficult period now in Argentina. So everything that we thought that it was possible, now we are kind of holding back. And you feel that saying all this film now politically is a little bit too much, because we are back to defending things that we thought that it would be kind of easy to attach to. Now the trials are being in consideration. They're thinking of new releases to military perpetrators. The abortion law is potentially under threat as well. So how we deal with these objects, these visual objects that now might even become a little bit vintage of another period. So it's a very difficult ethical inquiry, how to relate to these things that are still present, but are under negotiation and under discussion, and they still need to be fought for. Yeah, I would say straight away. Yeah.
Thank you. So I will do no sound bridge, but I'll have a violent cut and then make a pretend Dracula noise. Dun, 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 and we'll officially end the recorded portion here and then open things to kind of informal discussion. So thank you very much, Dr. Sosa, for your wonderful insights and for sharing this incredible film that you've made with Philippa Page and Alejo Moguillansky. And we will continue the conversation.
Perfect. Thank you.